Okay, great. So we're going to start. This is our session number 2 for our Wellness Week. The topic is drug awareness, and our presenter is Dr. April Lavergne. Dr. Lavergne serves as our Assistant Director, our Student Services Coordinator and our Director of Disability Services for our Florida Parishes location. Her Director of Disability Services position is a college-wide role, and so she supports our students. And actually, we just updated that title to be accessibility. So Director of Accessibility. It's still taking me getting some used to that adjustment as well. But she makes sure basically that our students receive all of the support that they need while they are getting their pursuing their academic studies, and she's doing an excellent job in that. And so I'm super excited to hear the information that she's going to share with us today. If you guys have any questions, so as she's going through the presentation, if you have questions, you can feel free to put those questions in the chat box. If there's information that she gives you, like an email address or something like that, I will try to type that information in the chat box as we go. So just be mindful of that. But again, if you have questions, because we will take time to answer questions at the end, so you can go ahead and start typing those in the chat box, and we will make sure that we get those answered. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Lavergne.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Montgomery. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon. Again, this is for drug awareness for our Wellness Week. And I'm just gonna go over a few things, mainly about, what the drugs are, how to be aware of them, how they can be abused, and, some help out there for those who are struggling with that kind of situation. So let me go ahead and share my screen so we can watch the presentation. So give me just 1 second so I can do that. All right, so can everybody see the PowerPoint? Okay, good deal. So of course, again, this is drug awareness, and this is for our college wellness week for November. It's not November, it is September 29th. So we'll go ahead and get started. When you're talking about drug awareness, you really want to talk about drug abuse. And generally when you're talking about drug abuse, you're talking about abuse to drugs or substance that refers to use of certain chemicals and creating a good feeling, pleasurable effects on your brain. And they're, according to the National Drug Association, there are over 190 million drug users around the world, which is very, very alarming. And there's a lot of long-term damage that can happen from the abuse of drugs, and also drug addicts who use needles can contract different things like HIV, hepatitis B and C, and just different infections. So it can really affect those people who are using drugs, not in the appropriate way. And it's just increasing. It's not doing very well. It's not getting better. It's actually increasing. And excuse me, I'm so sorry, I'm losing my voice. And it can be, even if they're using them in the short term, they can have an effect in the long term. So that's one of the bad things about, drug abuse, is that even in the short term, it can have long-term effects. So there's, different types of drugs. When you're talking about types of drugs, there's over-the-counter. Those are those medications that we can just walk into the pharmacy and get, like cough medicines, cold medicines. Now, and I know some people have noticed probably in recent years that some of those medicines have been moved behind the counter, and you actually have to go to the pharmacist, go to the pharmacy techs and get that medication. That is because of some of the components of those drugs are addictive, can be used to create other drugs, and can be used in a very bad way. Of course, one of those examples is methamphetamine. That's why things like NyQuil, Dayquil, those kind of drugs had to be moved, because you could use those to make the meth, unfortunately, and people were doing that, so they had to be moved behind the counters. And it's over the counter only because it does not have the same amounts of the drug in the over-the-counter as it would a prescription. So then when you're talking about prescription medicines, those are the medications that are prescribed by a doctor. They can treat many illnesses. They can help with like ADD, ADHD, depression, issues with the central nervous system, depression, sleep disorders. But part of those are the opioids, which we're going to talk about a little later. But those are prescription medications, things you have to get a prescription from a doctor to get, so not over the counter. And then you have the illegal drugs, those substances that you are not supposed to have. You're going to get in trouble if you have them. They're forbidden by law. So illegal drugs are just the ones that absolutely no over the counter, no prescription from a doctor. They are illegal. You are not supposed to have them. You will get in trouble. You'll go to jail. And that'll affect all different parts of your life as well. So what I'm going to share next is a video about the risk factors for drug abuse, because there are some risk factors that can come up for different individuals. So let me pull that video up right here. And this is actually from the Khan Academy. It actually works with their Khan Academy medicine. So if anybody wants to go look that up, they have a lot of great videos. But this is one that I thought was good to share.
I think that talking about risk factors for drug abuse can be really difficult. And that's just because there are so many different factors that feed into it. And also, I don't want to put too much emphasis on any one cause. I don't want to demonize any one thing. So I want to say right off the bat that there is no one thing that can lead to drug abuse or addiction. Instead, there are numerous factors that relate to each other in complicated ways. And I also want to mention that the presence of any or even all of these risk factors does not actually guarantee that an individual will become addicted to any substance, or will even use it all. Alright, well, with all of that said, now I am going to talk about some risk factors for substance abuse. So things that seem to correlate with substance abuse later in life. And we're going to talk about biological risk factors, psychological risk factors, and sociocultural and environmental risk factors. And let's start off with the biological factors. We know that if a child has a parent who abuses substances, they are more likely to abuse them as well. And this, in combination with the fact that identical twins have more similar rates of addiction than fraternal twins, seems to imply that there could be a genetic component to addiction. This is also supported by the fact that adopted children tend to resemble their biological parents more than their adopted parents, in terms of addiction rates. But even if genetics are involved, even if someone can have a genetic predisposition to substance abuse, this does not guarantee that a person will develop a substance abuse problem. Instead, it might make them more vulnerable to having one. Another biological risk factor has to do with the D2 receptor, which is a type of dopamine receptor in the reward circuitry of the brain. Some studies suggest that individuals with fewer D2 receptors might have a higher risk of addiction than those with a typical amount of receptors. We know that many substances are associated with an increase in dopamine within the reward circuits in the brain. And we also know that the body tries to counteract the effects of drugs through downregulation. So over time, the body will take away dopamine receptors if too much dopamine is present. And this would stop an individual from feeling pleasurable experiences, both when they take the drug, meaning that they'll have to take more to get the same high, but also in basically everything else in their life. And you can see how all of this would be particularly bad for individuals who had fewer D2 receptors to begin with. Having fewer receptors might also explain why individuals seek out drugs in the first place, because it takes more stimulation for them to naturally get a reward signal. Another biological risk factor for addiction has to do with comorbidity, meaning that individuals with certain psychiatric disorders might be more likely to have substance abuse problems as well. One of these disorders is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. And this actually makes a lot of sense to me, because individuals with ADHD tend to be impulsive. And as we will talk about later when we talk about psychological risk factors, impulsivity in general seems to be a risk factor for addiction. Other disorders that can sometimes go hand in hand with addiction are anxiety disorders and depression. And we're not entirely sure why this is the case, but some researchers have suggested that it might be because these individuals are trying to self-medicate for their conditions. However, we should also remember that this is a correlation, and even though we might be tempted to conclude that mental disorders lead to substance abuse, that might not be the case. It could be that substance abuse leads to mental disorders, or perhaps could trigger mental disorders in those who have a genetic predisposition. Or maybe both mental illness and substance abuse problems could be generated by a third factor, maybe some genetic vulnerability for both. Either way, it's important to keep in mind when we discuss all of these risk factors that correlation does not imply causation. Now let's move on to psychological risk factors. One thing that tends to get asked a lot is if there is such a thing as an addictive personality. And the answer is kind of. While there is no one single personality trait that causes a person to become addicted, researchers have identified a number of personality traits that seem to be present in many individuals with substance abuse problems. One of these is impulsivity. And I don't mean that in a fun, let's drop everything and go to the beach kind of way. When we talk about impulsivity here, we mean an inability to control oneself, the inability to inhibit one's actions even when faced with negative consequences. This is also sometimes referred to as behavioral disinhibition. Another component is sensation seeking, the need to seek out high levels of external stimulation and new experiences. So a constant need for new, more thrilling things in life. Things like skydiving or extreme sports or trying novel foods. Risk sensitivity also plays a role. So individuals who focus solely on the benefits of the experiences without thinking about the risks, or maybe failing to see how the risks might apply to them. The last personality factor that I want to talk about is neuroticism, or being abnormally tense and anxious and sensitive to stress. And these individuals might be at risk because they might attempt to minimize their stress reactions through self-medication. There are other psychological factors that can play a role that aren't personality traits. For example, we also know that individuals who tend to score high on aggression tests, so individuals who have feelings of aggression and aggressive behaviors, who also tend to act out at school or at home, they also seem to be at a higher risk of developing addiction later in life. Age can also play an important role. People who begin using substances as adolescents have a much greater chance of having a substance abuse disorder later in life. Let's move on to environmental risk factors. And here especially, it is important to keep in mind that the presence of any one of these factors does not guarantee that a person is going to use or abuse substances. Instead, we are looking at a pattern of environmental factors that might make an individual more vulnerable to addiction. And one of the most important environmental factors seems to be the presence of stress in an individual's life, both childhood stress as well as current stress. And we know this both from examining the lives of those individuals who have substance abuse problems, as well as from a number of animal studies. Animals who are placed in stressful environments tend to self-administer more substances than animals who are not exposed to stressors. And when we talk about stressors, we mean a lot of different things. Some of them might be family-related. Children in families with marital instability tend to have a higher risk, as are individuals who suffer abuse, whether that be physical or sexual or psychological. And before we talked about how evidence from family, twin, and adoption studies all seem to show that genes play a role in developing addiction, but it is also possible that there might be an added environmental effect as well in the form of modeling and imitation. So if a child watches a parent drink or use other substances as a coping mechanism, they might be more likely to model this behavior for themselves when they face stressors in adulthood. Lack of family involvement and family supervision also seems to increase the risk for substance abuse, as does not having a close family bond between an individual and their parents and their siblings. The friends an individual has can also play a role. If a friend group approves of substances and uses them, an individual is more likely to start. And this might be true for a number of reasons. One is that we make friends with people because of shared interests, and so we might hold things that our friends believe in high esteem. Another reason is social facilitation. Substances are often consumed in a group setting, and so they can serve to enhance social bonds. We have not mentioned it yet, but of course, peer pressure can also play a role. Individuals might be pressured into using substances by their peers, either directly by them saying that the individual should use those substances, or indirectly by giving the impression that it is or will be an important part of peer bonding. The community an individual is in can also play a role. There is a higher concentration of substance abuse within low SES communities and communities that are faced with poverty. Those who lack education and don't really have an employment history seem to be at the greatest risk. But I want to point out something important, which is that while there might be more substance abuse within these low SES communities, there isn't necessarily more substance use. It could be that those in impoverished communities lack the safety net, things like education and strong support networks and financial stability, that keep those in higher SES communities from moving from use to abuse. The availability of substances can also make a big difference. When substances are available, people are more likely to use. And the type of drug can also make a difference. Those with a fast rate of administration, so those that are injected or snorted or smoked, are more likely to be abused than those that are ingested orally because they take effect faster, because they produce a faster high, a faster reward. And this causes the brain to form a stronger association, which might make it more likely that they will crave the drug again in the future. These substances also fade faster, which also makes users more likely to use again to continue the high. And you might think that all of these environmental factors are less important than some of the biological and psychological factors that we talked about before. But I want you to know that this just isn't the case. And so I want to take a minute to talk about a study that highlights how important they are. You might be familiar with studies that show that a rat alone in a cage with access to drugs will basically use continuously, sometimes neglecting food and water. But I want to point out that these rats are left alone in a cage with literally nothing else to do. And so they're in an environment without a lot of other options except for using the substance. And to figure out what effect this might be having on the studies, some researchers built what was called the rat park, which was a large cage filled with lots of engaging toys and fun things to play with, things like balls and tunnels. And it also had the best rat food that they could get, and it had lots of rats all living together, all with access to the enriching food and activities. Basically, it was rat paradise. And wouldn't you know it, even though the researchers made drugs available in Rat Park, the same way that they were made available in experiments with a solitary rat in an unstimulating cage, the rats in Rat Park didn't abuse substances. And for those few rats who did use, it was in much smaller amounts. And this is absolutely incredible to me, and I still remember how shocked I was when I first learned it. And even though it's really hard to compare animal models to human models, I think it's important to consider what this might have to say about human substance abuse. So we've talked about biological risk factors, psychological risk factors, and environmental risk factors. But I want to note that even though I've discussed them separately, these three things are actually interconnected. Certain environmental factors might put an individual at a greater risk for drug abuse, but it is only when those things are combined with biological and psychological predispositions that they would start to take effect. Or saying that a different way, individuals with a biological predisposition and certain psychological traits might only be at risk if they're placed within certain environmental situations.
Okay. So, we'll get out of there. Okay. So I wanted to stop it there because I kind of felt that that kind of talked about what, substance abuse and what the factors are. And that what I really liked about the video though was that she talked about that even though these can be mitigating factors for abuse, it's not necessarily that these things are absolutely going to say this person is going to use a substance or abuse a substance or whatever the case may be. But I just found it really interesting that, it really spoke to how, the rat example, the rat park was really interesting to see because the rat was by itself, had nothing else to do. What did it do? It had no support. It had no one else to be with. And they're social creatures just like we are. We like to be around others. We like to support each other. So when they had others around, there was much less of that going on. So that's what I really liked about that video was actually the rat park, just kind of putting a simple, idea together And I'm going to go look up that more of that study later to see more of what's going on there. So to continue with the PowerPoint, we talked about the illegal drugs, the risk factors for drug abuse, and then current issues. So some of the current issues that we're dealing with is one of them is the opioid crisis. And I know we've seen probably around our local areas track in Tangipahoa Parish. And what they're trying to do is work with individuals who are, addicted to opioids, which are prescription pain relievers, heroin, fentanyl. These are all considered opioids. And we are in the middle of a crisis with this because this is growing. This is continuing. 2018, 128 people in the United States die after overdosing on opioids. That's just in 2018. And I know that number's grown exponentially since then. They're losing the cost of healthcare for it, productivity in these individuals, treatment, criminal justice involvement, because opioids, of course, when you're talking about heroin and different things like that, are illegal drugs. Even if they're prescription pain relievers, there's still that component of them, if they're abusing them or not using them right or selling them, because some individuals will get into an addiction and then be using those drugs and selling them to try to feed their own addiction. So then they're, even though it's their medication, it's prescribed to them, they're addicted, they need more, they need, can only get so much from the doctors. So that's where this opioid crisis is coming from, is that, these prescription pain relievers, again, heroin, fentanyl, it's just causing such a problem that we're having to address as a community in Louisiana, in the United States as a whole, in other countries. It's just becoming a major problem. It's a national problem, it's an international problem. So to try to combat that, especially in Tangipahoa Parish, TRAC, which I just lost what TRAC stands for. I just went out of my head. But they are a group who are trying to help fight this crisis in Tangipahoa Parish. They are offering resources. They offer, rehab, anything that they can try to do to help individuals. They're trying to educate individuals and give them information to find help for this this opioid crisis, because if it keeps going the way it's going, it's going to have a major impact. Already has had a major impact, but it'll just continue to get worse. But they are doing a great thing, and there's many other groups like them across the country that are trying to help fight this crisis in the United States, and it's happening, and they're doing that also elsewhere. So what they're doing is great work. We normally have them come to campus for Wellness Week, but with COVID and everything, maybe we can get them on when we're allowed to have more individuals on campus again. So the next thing, especially because we're in the midst of COVID, they're talking about COVID-19 and substance abuse disorder. There's a short video I wanted to share with that, just to talk about it, because this is happening right now in our current environment, and this is another current issue that's going on for individuals, talking about, being aware of what's going on in all parts of our environment. So give me just one moment. And this is from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. A lot of good resources.
Dr. Volkov, let's start by talking about the risks of COVID. What do we know about possibly increased risks of contracting COVID or getting a more severe case for people who are struggling with addiction or who are in recovery?
Well, it is a new pandemic, so we don't have much data that has emerged that can actually give us the evidence of exactly what is it that happened. However, because of what we know of COVID, recognizing that certain comorbidities, particularly pulmonary and cardiac, are going to put you at greater risk, we can clearly actually predict that individuals with a substance use disorder are going to be at higher risk of adverse outcomes from COVID, because they are much more likely to have these comorbidities due to the effects of drug exposures in pulmonary and respiratory diseases. The other component too that relates to infection, the risk of infection, we know that if you are addicted to drugs and you don't have a support system and you are actually out there in the streets trying to get these drugs, you're much more likely, therefore, to encounter conditions where you may get infected. And we also know on a third level is that many of the drugs of abuse themselves indirectly or directly affect the physiology of our bodies. So for example, if you are using opioids, that produces respiratory depression. And respiratory depression leads to lower oxygen content in the lungs, which of course makes you then much more vulnerable for any infection that is going to be targeting pulmonary function. These are three of the events that we can actually, from which we can predict that individuals with a substance use disorder.
What are some of the challenges that people in recovery specifically might be facing now?
I mean, we are social creatures, we human beings, and we depend on social support in order to actually do many of the things and for a sense of well-being. And this is also the case for individuals that are fighting drugs or are on recovery. The social supports are fundamental for providing a structure that will increase the likelihood that they will succeed. So as we in the COVID epidemic have had to exert social distancing, this can make it much harder for those that are trying to achieve recovery or are on recovery to stay on recovery when those social structural systems are no longer there.
And also so challenging people who are now struggling with substance use. What do they need to know in terms of challenges that are out there? And also, what do their friends and family need to know and possibly that they could do to help?
Well, like anything that has such a tragic effect on our society, it leads us to come up with solutions. And some of those solutions actually can, if taken advantage of, can significantly help outcomes. So if someone is addicted to drugs and they see these services in the community closing down, it is very important for them to realize that now there has been an expansion on access of telehealth applications that enable them to receive treatment or support, including social network support through these applications.
You've seen firsthand how stigma can take a toll on people who are struggling with addiction. What lessons learned have you seen from your work that we should keep in mind now during COVID?
I think it is very relevant that we all recognize our emotions when we are faced with someone and be aware that we are under very stressful conditions and that we have to learn to be more tolerant to diversity as it relates, of course, in general to all different ways of looking at the world, but importantly, as it relates to someone that may come or need help, being able to create that sense of trust on the person that is suffering from addiction so that they can seek out the help is also very important.
Here at NIH, scientific research is our business, of course. What research questions has COVID-19 prompted for you as a researcher?
Well, there are many questions that this pandemic hitting the epidemic of opioid crisis in the United States has posed to me in terms of research, starting from better understanding about what this collision means to people out there suffering from addiction, their families, and the healthcare system and justice settings that are dealing with it. What are the realities people are facing and how diverse are they and how are the communities addressing these challenges? As a researcher in neuroscience, I'm obviously extremely interested, like many others, of the extent to which the virus may influence the brain and how does it influence it in terms of does it cross the blood-brain barrier or are its effects predominantly indirect through exacerbating immune responses that then affect how the brain functions? Well, what happens in terms of brain development if a mother who's pregnant gets infected with COVID? How does that influence, does the virus influence the brain? And are you going to be seeing it clinically, or will it be a silent infection? These are some of the example of the questions that are extraordinarily important for us to investigate so that we can guide better the patients themselves, but also the interventions and follow-up and monitoring of these patients.
Absolutely. We have so much to learn. Dr. Volkov, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you for watching. For more information, please visit drugabuse.gov.
So I found that video very interesting just because the current climate, where we are, what we're dealing with, how those resources are being, kind of not there for individuals, but also how they're changing to have those resources in a, as she spoke about, telehealth, knowing that those resources, even though that they've moved, that they're still there. And this is some of those resources, just a very small list of some of the resources that are available. There's the SAMHSA National Helpline. There, you can go to their website, but you can also call their 800 number. The National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. They have a website and a call number. The National Institute of Mental Health, because as we've seen in all of the discussions, that mental health can be tied to substance abuse, unfortunately, because like they said in the video earlier, some individuals may self-medicate trying to help with those issues that they're having. So, but this is just a very short list. And then at the bottom, it's the National Institute of Drug Abuse. They have a large number of resources available on their website. So I just put that link down there, in case we may know somebody in our community who may need help, or come to us because we are, we're a public entity, we're a public institution. So, any way that we can try and help. These are some great resources that I was able to find here. But that kind of concludes my presentation. Were there any questions? Let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
If you have questions, you can go ahead and put those in the chat box. I'll give you guys a few seconds to do that.
Now, of course, through Northshore, we have resources that we can give to our students if they're, needing any help with anything, mental health, those different kind of things. They can always come to student services, and we're always happy to help in any way that we can, because we're in a weird time. That's why I wanted to include the COVID-19, because they said there's all sorts of things happening that had not previously been there before, roadblocks, obstacles, and all of that for individuals who are needing to come, to needing that help. So they're having to find other resources, and we're having to, be able to support all of that as well for our college.
And one thing, just to add on to April's presentation, again, if you guys have questions, you can feel free to type them as we're talking. One thing we have to be mindful of is with everything that's going on right now, in many cases, and this applies to the faculty and staff that are on the session, but also to the students, and many times people are dealing with some very heavy things on a normal day. So when you add on all of the challenges that are going on right now, anytime it's from a mental health perspective, you isolate a person to where they're not able to engage and get that emotional stimulation, it will cause them to divert to substances more quickly, where they used to be able to. It's one thing to talk to someone over the phone or virtually, but to actually sit in the room with someone, there's certain feelings that you can't really express without having that body language, without having that physical touch, just to be able to get that hug from someone that's telling you it's going to be okay, I'm with you. And so we have a lot of folks that were having challenges prior to this, but were able to get some sort of relief. We have a lot of students who school was that release for them. And so many of them are not able to come every day like they were. So this, coming to school was therapy for them. And so one thing that we have to be mindful of is making sure that when we do have the opportunity to engage with our students, to engage with our colleagues, even if it is virtually, let's really look to see if there are some cues there that we're seeing that this person is maybe not behaving the way that we know them to behave, or there's some signs out there, so that we can kind of be a community that looks out for each other and that we help each other along the way. For the students, if you know that your fellow classmate there's something going on, sometimes it is drug induced, sometimes it is something totally different. It could be mental health, or it could be that they're just having a bad day. If you do feel that there's something happening with the student, or even if it could be a faculty member that is something is off, make sure that you're communicating that with us, because there are resources available. There is support available. And so we just have to, the biggest thing is communication. And I always say, see something, say something. You all know each other. Students, you know each other. Faculty and staff, we know our students and we know our colleagues. When we see that something is off, we need to make sure, especially during these times where people can't easily get the access to some of those resources physically, we need to make sure that we are kind of giving them a helping hand in that way, by keeping our eyes open and making sure we're, even if it's not you telling someone else, having a conversation with that individual and saying, listen, I know you may not be open to talking, but here are some resources that I'm aware of that would be helpful to you. Sometimes people are just looking for that leg up, for somebody to say, I see you. I know that there's something's going on, and I want to help in any way that I can. And I'm here to listen, I see that Ms. Alley says, if a person has the trifecta of environmental, psychological, and biological factors, what can they do to be proactive? And April, I'll let you start with that, with your response, and then I'll chime in from there. If a person has the trifecta, that's environmental, psychological, and biological, what can they do to be proactive?
And I think that's come up a lot in reading and everything, getting ready for today. What came up was a lot, if they know they have environmental factors, if they know they have biological factors, like they have a parent, or they're in an environment where they're in that kind of situation, is starting to get that help ahead of time, looking for those resources, reaching out to someone, because I know, from personal experience, with some family members, that there was that knowing that could happen, and that was a part of a environmental and biological factor in the family, that you can go ahead of that and be like, okay, I know this can happen. Let me get ahead of it. Let me start reaching out already, because those resources aren't just for individuals who are already suffering. It can be people who may suffer, knowing that they're going to get into this situation or be in this environment, especially if they have, like individuals with depression. They know they have depression. They know that this could happen. Get ahead of that. They can get those resources, talk to somebody, find those supports. Even if it's just, for instance, we're here in student services, and we have access to resources to give to our students, our faculty and staff, whoever. If a student needed something, they can come to us, or if a faculty and staff, we have access to wellness through our health benefits. Just knowing that there's somebody to reach out to, and being able to know, but it's really getting ahead of it. If they know that they have that, is getting ahead of it and trying to stay ahead of it. It's not always going to be the perfect answer, and it may not ultimately it may still have some effect, but having that and getting in front of it is so important. So that's a lot of what I read about in researching for the topic.
And really the only way that you can stay in front of it is to know what the triggers are in those three categories. Because that's one of the consistent things when you're looking at environmental, psychological, and biological. They're all three of those categories have triggers. You know, is it that the environmental issues are tied to employment? That, you know, when the student is able to keep a steady job, or when their spouse is able to keep a steady job, then their home life is in a different space. But when they're having employment issues, that's when they kind of bottom out a bit. You know, there's always a trigger there. When it comes to psychological, is it stress induced? You know, is it certain times of the year? Is it when certain events happen? I was just speaking earlier with a veterans representative, and I was telling him that I had a student in the past that while we would celebrate the 4th of July, you know, and we always have connected that to, you know, celebrating our country. I always kind of connected that to just being proud of being American. For some individuals in the military, they don't like that holiday because of all the fireworks and different things like that. They have some PTSD because those noises bring them back to basically warfare. So they can't, where you would think they would be some of the ones that were most, you know, involved, that there's a trigger there. So, you know, that particular student had identified, this is one of my triggers. So we put up signage in my yard that, you know, so my neighbors know, you know, please try not to do this, because it would trigger his psychological health at that time. You know, biological factors, you know, is it that I tend to drink more, or does it have a impact on my health, or do I do this when I'm struggling with certain health issues, or is this something that has been present in my family? Is drug use something that, or coping in any type of substance, is that something that has been present in my family? You know, is there a history behind this? So you kind of have to look at what those triggers are, where it stems from. What am I trying to mask here? What is the benefit? What am I getting away from? What am I healing by doing this? What am I trying to put a Band-Aid on when I do this? And that kind of helps to begin to get to that point of recovery. Counseling is a major component of that, because many times you know what the triggers are, but you don't know how to get past that. If you knew how to do it on your own, you would do it on your own. You know, if I knew how to just stop using drugs, or stop drinking alcohol, or stop smoking, or stop, you know, cutting, or stop whatever the case may be that's impacting me, I would do that. But in many cases, the challenges are so great, and the situation that individuals are trying to cope with is so great that they don't know where to start. And so that's where counseling and therapy, and it doesn't come with just one session. Sometimes people have to go through counseling for years before they get to a space, to a place where they can stop doing something or can change that behavior, and that's okay. Progress is progress. You know, if you go from, like we were talking about smoking earlier, if last month you were smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, and this month it's only half a pack of cigarettes a day, that's progress. And so that's what counseling and therapy kind of helps you to get that objective view, to help you figure out and find your way, but also to call you out when you're not being honest with yourself, and when you're not really dealing with some deeply rooted things. So yeah, just looking for those triggers is a key component in kind of turning the corner on any form of abuse. Do we have any other questions? I'm looking at the chat. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to share a couple of things with you before we end the session. Again, this session will be available for students to and faculty and staff to go back and view at a later time. I am going to upload these links so you all can view them, and I will send them out once Wellness Week is over. But let me share my screen here. Okay, so can you guys see that flyer? No. What about now?
It's coming up. Yep, there it is.
Okay, so cool thing about our Learning Commons is there's so much information out there. When we started talking about Wellness Week, our director of library services reached out to me and said, hey, we've got tons of research sources in the Learning Commons that can be used to do research and find out more information on so many topics that are related to health and wellness. So if you look, I don't know if you guys could have access to the chat, but I did send a link through the chat. If you guys can see that, the first link is the health and wellness document. That is this one that you're looking at. And can you guys see that second document I just clicked on? Okay, so this is the other thing that we want to promote. So with everything going on, we know that we're living in a high stress time right now with just so many challenges for all of us, for faculty and staff, and we've kind of had the opportunity to talk through some things through convocation and different things like that. But we wanted to provide a platform for our students to basically talk with our chancellor, to submit questions. So I'm going to be emailing this out this week to the student body, allowing them to submit questions to our chancellor, and then he's going to do a Zoom call similar to this format to address those questions with students. And then if we have time, we'll also answer some questions in real time. So I'm super excited about that because I know our students, there's a lot of things that we can learn from them. And it's important that we hear feedback of what their experience is right now. We're doing a lot of work to try to make them feel as supported and as comfortable as possible with our current challenges. However, I do feel that we need to get some feedback on them just to check in and see how they're doing, you know, what are some of the concerns. And Dr. Wainwright, he brought this suggestion to me. He said, I want to have a conversation with them and I want them to ask me questions and so we can provide them some clarity. So I'll begin promoting this week. The event is next week. That's next Thursday, October the 8th, 11:30 to 12:30. So you guys promote it. When you see the email come out, promote it because we do want to engage. Also, make sure that you promote Wellness Week. I did send out some reminder emails about it. So last night, Microsoft Teams crashed. So my reminder email to students did not go through, but they just got another reminder email from me today. They'll get another reminder email in the morning. So hopefully we'll have more students to engage in the days to come. Definitely appreciate the ones that are on today. Our attendance was pretty good at the 12 o'clock as well. And also, as always, we appreciate our faculty and staff that support our team members. And also thank you to Dr. Lavergne for pulling this information together. We tried to do a different format this year. We didn't want to just cancel Wellness Week because we feel that it's very important. And so our 12 o'clock presentation came from Beth Frobe at our Hammond campus, and now we have Dr. Lavergne coming from our Florida Parishes campus. So during these presentations, students will hear from individuals from all of the different campuses and get some very valuable information. So please share the information about this session. And we're so excited about Wellness Week this year. And we know that the rest of the week is gonna go well also. All right, if we don't have any other questions, Dr. Lavergne, do you have any other comments?
That's it. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon.
All righty. Thank you guys. You all have a wonderful day and we hope to see you tomorrow.
Yay. Bye.